If you have your Bibles, go ahead and get them out and go to Colossians. Today is our last Sunday in the book of Colossians. If you can believe that. I honestly did not think it was going to take this long. And you can ask Holly, our designer. We were ready to do Daniel this fall, because that's our next book. And it's just taken a long time. And it's because it's just jam-packed with all kinds of stuff. But today's the last day. And what we're really trying to figure out last week and then today with these last two sermons in Colossians, these final instructions, are whether or not we've actually gotten what this book is about. And when I say whether or not we've gotten what it's about, I don't mean intellectually, like we understand the concept or the theology or the philosophy or the doctrine, but whether or not it's made its way into our heart and we've started practicing it. That we believe it to the point where it's impacted our lives. We've talked for months about the preeminence of Christ. Literal months in 3 chapters of a book of the Bible. His preeminence in the world, his preeminence in the church, his preeminence in our lives as individuals, his preeminence in our home, in our marriage, in our relationships. We've seen over and over again that Jesus really is above all things. But before we move on into Advent, which is next Sunday, can't wait for that. And then after Advent is going to be Daniel, which, man, if you've ever read the book of Daniel, you know it's going to be awesome. But before we get into those things, we've got to stop and ask ourselves, okay, have we actually believed this really important stuff? Is this just some good doctrine that we've got in our heads, or is this some good doctrine that has made its way into our hearts? Have we simply heard the truth and filed it away under theology I understand? Or have we started putting it into practice? I'll tell you one of the most convicting passages in the whole Bible, and I have this as a slide, I believe, James 1:22. Listen to this. Be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he looks like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be happy in all his doing. And so listen, as we close up our time in this incredible letter, we want to stop and ask, are we hearers who forget, or are we doers who act? That's what we're doing in these last 2 sessions together. And there are 2 main tests, as I showed you last week, that we can run to tell which kind of person we are. Both of them are in this final paragraph of Colossians 4. We're actually not even going to finish all of the nitty-gritty logistics of Colossians 4 because it's more local to that context. But first, what we saw last week, if Christ is really preeminent in your life and you've really got this, then you'll be a person who prays consistently. You'll be a person who prays earnestly, expectantly, and missionally. We saw that last week. The second thing, though, this is the second test, and this is what we're going to see today, is that if Christ is really preeminent in your life, then you'll be a person who witnesses wisely, earnestly, and graciously. And let me just say, these are what I think are probably the 2 most important litmus tests of whether or not our faith is real or it's a fraud. In the South, everyone's got faith. Everyone's a Christian. It's Bible Belt. It's Billy Graham land. Billy Graham's childhood church is literally right down the road. Grace Covenant Church. It's still standing. My friend Chad's the pastor there. Awesome guy. Great church. There's a highway named after an evangelist here in Charlotte. That's weird. Everyone's a Christian. How do you know if you really are, if your faith is a fraud? I think these are the 2 most important litmus tests. If you want to verify your relationship with Christ, that's a faith that does, not just a faith that thinks. I think a lot of times we evaluate it like if we said a prayer. Even when we were like a kid or something, we said the prayer. That's how you measure your relationship with Christ. What we saw last week, though, is that the true test of our relationship with Christ is not whether or not we said a prayer, but whether or not we live lives of prayer. That's the first test. The second test, well, let me just say, that was really challenging for me last week. Okay? I'm right there with you. So I know I'm standing on a stage and I'm elevated and I'm behind this thing and I got a microphone, but I am right there with you. Okay? Last week was really challenging for me. If you thought last week was challenging, buckle up. Today will be challenging as well. Second litmus test. We like to verify our relationship with Christ typically by whether or not we are not going to hell. But what we're going to see today is that the true test of our relationship to Christ isn't whether or not we've got good fire escape plan, but whether or not we are giving our lives to those who don't. I read a story this past week of a young man who was applying for a job as an usher at a theater in the mall. Now, I didn't know you had to apply for that job. I didn't even know there was an interview process for that job. You work at a theater, you watch movies and sweep up popcorn, but evidently there is a hiring process. And as he's meeting with his manager and his manager's interviewing him, the one question that his manager asked him was, "What would you do in case a fire breaks out?" That's actually a good question for an usher. And so the guy said, "Oh, don't worry about me. I did out okay." he probably thought, "Oh, I nailed that interview. Did a great job." Actually, he didn't. You know, as easy as it might be to get a job at a theater as an usher, one thing you have to be able to do is you have to help people find the escape in case of emergency. That's what an usher is. That's what an usher does. I couldn't help but think that this is how a lot of us Christians in the South approach our faith. We ask the question, what would you do if you knew Jesus was going to come back a second time? Which I think we all believe that because we just sang it. What would you do if you believed that Jesus was coming back a second time? What would you do if you believed eternity was in balance? And that every single person that you know, every single person you've ever interacted with, is either going to spend an eternity in infinite joy or an eternity in infinite sorrow? How would you respond? What would you do if the one who created all things and sustains all things and holds all things together and rules all things is one day coming back to redeem and renew and restore all things? Would you say, "Oh, don't worry about me, I'll be fine. I know how to get out. I know how to get in"? Guys, listen to me. Ushers are responsible for getting people out in case of emergency. Christians are responsible for getting people in to the presence of God in light of eternity. Man, I was never expected to do this as a kid growing up in a great Christian church in the South. Never once expected to make a disciple. Spurgeon put it this way, though. Legend. Every Christian is either a missionary or an imposter. I told you it was going to be fun today. Welcome to Life Church. Let me quote Piper. I have this quote, Hazel. "Christianity is a soul-winning, outreaching, mind-persuading, heart-entreating, rescuing, missionary faith, or it is not true Christianity." So a follower of Jesus who isn't actively trying to bring others to Jesus isn't functioning like a true follower. I'm going to imagine that many of you have never heard that before. That's our fault as pastors. I'm glad you're here today. If last week felt like a wake-up call, this one will too, but I'm telling you right now, and this is a new process for me too, by the way. This is like the last decade of my life, and I've been a Christian for longer than that. Let me just tell you, if you really believe this and hear it and you get it and you respond to it today, your life will never look the same. For the better. And every single person in your life will benefit from you for all eternity. Now that's incredible, and I want to show you what I mean. So look at the text with me. We'll go after it together. Colossians 4, 5 through 6. Again, this is the final instruction. This is the last thing Paul is writing for us in Colossians. Walk in wisdom toward outsiders. Oh man, just that word outsiders should break your heart. Outsiders. Outside of the presence of God. People who don't know the joy of His love and His compassion and His mercy. Outsiders. Walk in wisdom toward outsiders. Making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious. Always seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. In other words, if you want to know if you've got the book of Colossians in your heart and not just in your head, if Christ is really preeminent in your life, don't just evaluate how often you pray for outsiders, evaluate how you treat them and interact with them, and ultimately bear witness to them. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit, because there's 3 really important qualities, as there always are, of this kind of witness that demonstrate whether or not Christ is all in all. And the first one is that we should walk in wisdom. Another way of saying this is that Christ-centered witness is rooted in wisdom. Look back at verse 5. Walk in wisdom toward outsiders. Isn't it fascinating that he doesn't say, stay away from outsiders? That he doesn't say, look down on outsiders? That he doesn't say, thank God I'm not like an outsider? No, for Paul, being loved by Jesus and being led by Jesus produced in him the desire to walk with outsiders, which is another way of saying to live with outsiders. This is really important for us to get, because pendulums were made for swinging, okay? And you're somewhere on a pendulum right now in every aspect of your life. And it's good to evaluate ourselves all the time, because you never know where you are on that pendulum. It's really important, though, for us to understand that to be in one extreme is not a good thing. And usually when we realize we're in that extreme, we correct, but the result of that correction is an overcorrection. And we end up in another extreme, and it's just as bad. It's just the opposite extreme. And so in this letter, the Colossians were in one extreme when it came to outsiders. And that extreme was syncretism. They were totally adapted and just a part of the culture. Their church had been permeated with outsiders in every way. Take a little Judaism here, take a little magic here, that was probably fun. Take a little asceticism here, a little folk tradition here, a little Christianity here. And so in the end, their church looked a lot more like culture and nothing like Christ. That's one extreme. And so Paul has just come in here and he's like, man, Christ is it. Get rid of all the other stuff. He's above all. He's supreme. He's sufficient. He's preeminent. That's why we call it above all. Like, he is all you need. And so he's correcting them. That's the purpose of this letter. The American church struggles with this as well, don't we? And we've seen this over the past few months. Syncretism. Paul is now telling them at the very end of this letter that, listen, I'm correcting you for this syncretism, but I know what you're going to try to do. I know you're going to try to swing right over here to this other extreme, and that's not good. And so he's trying to stop them right away, because what's the opposite extreme of syncretism? It's sectarianism. It's separatism. It basically says, okay, culture is amazing. Outsiders got all the wisdom and the tradition and the philosophy and everything we need. And then sectarianism says everything is bad in the world. Let's create our own little subculture, our own little counterculture, and never interact with anyone on the outside. And so Paul knows the pendulums. And he knows they're over here. He knows they're going to swing over here. So he's trying to stop it right before it starts. I grew up in this tradition. The tradition that was on this side of the pendulum. The pendulum of separatism, of sectarianism. And so I know exactly what he's talking about. The unspoken idea with that extreme is basically that sin is somehow contagious. And it's like a disease that other people have. People on the outside have this disease, and if you get too close to them, you might catch the disease. And so instead of getting close to them, what you need to do is avoid them. Stay safe, stay good, only hang out with good Christian people. Now, my parents and I laugh at a lot of this stuff today because they were just trying the best they could, and in a lot of ways they didn't know any better. They would say this, to this day. They were both raised and discipled in this tradition, and I always call my dad a recovering separatist. Okay, and he's just been in that process, and I've witnessed it for 35 years, and it's incredible. They've grown out of this, but when we were kids, we lived in this extreme. We had this rule, and I've told you this rule before, but I haven't told you the twist. We had this rule, it was the 3 cuss word rule. And basically, if swear words were like strikes, 3 strikes and you're out, it was 3 swear words and you're done. So if you were watching a movie and there were 3 cuss words, like it would be on 2. And then it would get to like 2.5 with like a crap or something like that. And we'd be like, oh no, and we would get so anxious, and we would get so nervous, and we'd start sweating, like, please don't swear again. And then they would swear, and my dad would be like, well, that's it. I can't tell you how many movies I've seen the beginning 20 minutes of. I've seen them all. But the thing about this 3 cuss word rule was that it didn't just apply to movies, it applied to people as well. And so, we're in junior high, and we have tons of kids in our neighborhood, and so in junior high back then, Tony Hawk was huge, Bones Brigade was huge. If you haven't heard of any of that stuff, man, it's like these documentaries are on Netflix. You need to go educate yourselves. But we were all into skateboarding, and aggressive rollerblading was a thing too. And so me and my friends, I know. I thought it was so cool though. And we had the baggy pants out to here, like the 50-inchers, Anyways, okay, so me and my friends built a ramp, and then we built this long rail that we could grind on. And grinding is like you just grind your board or your blades down this pole, and you try to do tricks on it. And they have all these names for the tricks and everything. It's very cool. And so we did this. And we're in junior high, and one day we're out there on the streets being real cool, and the high schoolers joined us who lived next door to my friend Daniel. And immediately we got nervous. Because it's not that they were like meanies, all right? They weren't bullies or anything, but we just didn't want to go home. And we were afraid that they would make us have to leave. And so my friend Davey, who lived next door to these guys, were begging them, please don't swear. If you say more than 3 words, we have to go home. Please don't. I mean, I'm not exaggerating right now. We're begging them. And we're skating, and they're trying their hardest. But we're skating, and we're like falling and getting hurt. And so every once in a while you'd hear like this guy fall, and a 4-letter word would come out of his mouth, and we'd be like, no! What are you doing? And he'd be like, oh, I'm so sorry. And then another guy did it, and it was 2, and I'm telling him, we're like, don't do it again. We were getting mad at this point. We're like, just go home, like, you're gonna ruin our fun. And then, of course, what happened, the 3rd word, and we were just like, no. There were too many witnesses. Like, word would have gotten back to my parents that we heard 3 cuss words. And so we were like, we gotta go home. And so we did. That is sectarianism. That's separatism. Now listen, what I want to show you today in this first point is that wisdom is neither syncretism nor is it sectarianism. Both of those are wrong extremes, okay? It isn't adopt everything in culture and adapt to everything in culture, and it also isn't avoid everything in culture. Both of those are wrong. And so that means that on this side, we don't adopt sinful practices. And we don't adopt sinful ideologies and traditions that permeate our culture. Like, let me just give you some examples and see if maybe you have a syncretistic life right now. A preoccupation with sports and entertainment. That's our culture. The binging of sensuality on our devices. And I'm not just talking about explicit pornography. I'm talking about like any sensuality on TV that our grandfathers would have blushed at, couldn't have even imagined that. And it's just like par for the course on every show, in every movie. What about our obsession with wealth and status? Where did that come from? Is that from the Bible or is that from culture? What about our fixation on sexual liberation and just the idea that our happiness hinges on us gratifying every single urge that our body has? Where did that come from? What about our infatuation with physical beauty? What about our addiction to all forms of substances? Guys, all of these practices and traditions and ideas and idols permeate our culture. They're things that we should actually avoid. And many of us have adopted and adapted. In fact, I'm rereading a book right now by Kent Hughes called Disciplines of a Godly Man. It's the first book I ever read as a Christian. They have one called Disciplines of a Godly Woman too. You should read it. We should probably put more book in it. And I've been so convicted again about the fact that he wrote this book long before Netflix, long before streaming, and he did the math, and there are all these sociologists that did the math, but you were going to watch 90,000 hours of TV before you die. And that was before streaming. Which means you're going to see more violence and more sensuality and more gore and more sin glorified than literally our dads and moms and our grandparents never saw in a lifetime we're going to see. Never dreamed of. All these practices are things to avoid, not because God is a meanie, and not because God's trying to ruin your fun, but because they keep us from Him. They keep us from truth, and they keep us from living life the way He designed it to be lived, which is to the fullest. And so we should avoid them. See, to be holy is to be set apart. That means that we are in the world, but not of the world. It means that we're exiles on a journey back to our homeland. And some of you need to hear this, and I need to hear this today because you weren't raised in a sectarian tradition. You were raised in a syncretistic tradition, and you don't even know it. You've never even evaluated how you interact with outsiders. It's just all good. That's not wisdom. It's not syncretism, and it's not sectarianism. And so the big question then is, what does it mean to walk in wisdom toward outsiders? You know what the answer is? It is literally Jesus. The answer to what it looks like to walk in wisdom is walk in Jesus. Walk like Jesus. He is the personification of wisdom. In fact, John 1:1-5 literally is all about this. It says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and I'm going to summarize, I don't have this on the screen. He was with God, and all things were created through Him, and all enlightenment is found in Him. And the word in the Greek for word, in the beginning was the word is logos, and one of its meanings, one of its most important meanings in the ancient world was the wisdom of God. In the beginning was the wisdom of God. And He was with God from the beginning, and He was God from the beginning, and that wisdom spoke everything into existence, and it sustains and holds everything in existence. And then verse 14 says, the wisdom of God took on flesh and dwelt among us. Do you want to know what wisdom looks like? Look at the man. Look at God made flesh. Wisdom personified is Jesus. And so, how did Jesus walk? How did Jesus treat outsiders? Man, we could spend the rest of our lives talking about that, but let me just give you two ideas. Radical compassion and radical conviction. That's wisdom. That's Jesus. Radical compassion and radical conviction. Don't look at it yet. Matthew 5:8, I think, is a perfect example of this. I was getting ahead of my notes. I'm getting too excited. Matthew 5-7 is one of the most famous sermons, if not the most famous sermon in the history of the world. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. It's Jesus preaching, and it's incredible, and it'll change your life. And in that sermon, Jesus raises the bar on everything. And he raises the bar especially on sexuality and purity, what it means to be pure. He says adultery isn't just a physical act, but it's also a mental act and an emotional act. And if you've ever lusted after someone in your heart, you've committed adultery. That is radical conviction, right? But then, what does he do right after preaching that sermon? In Matthew chapter 8. What is the next scene? Does he turn up his nose toward all of the sexual sinners and the audience? No way. Does he make his way through the crowd like a running back, trying to dodge as many of them as he can so he doesn't catch their sin disease? No way. The very next scene in chapter 8, he finds a leper who was as much of an outsider as you could find in the ancient world. And everyone believed that he had leprosy or she had leprosy because of sin. Jesus goes and finds the outsider and he heals him. It's right after the sermon. Radical compassion. He finds a Roman centurion who, by the way, was the man responsible for oppressing the people of God. He finds the Roman centurion and he heals his son. Radical compassion. He finds 2 demoniacs, outsiders, and he sets them free. Again, radical compassion. Then, guys, in the next chapter, the next scene, Matthew chapter 9, he finds a tax collector named Matthew, who just so happens to be the author of the Gospel of Matthew. He's the worst of the worst. He's a total outsider. And Jesus makes that guy a part of his inner circle. Look at what happens next. Matthew 9, verse 10. And Jesus reclined at the table in Matthew's house. Now he's hanging out with the sinner. Behold, many tax collectors and many sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when Jesus heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." This is the incredible thing about Jesus. Jesus taught the highest standards of sexuality and purity and holiness ever found in any sacred writing in the history of the world. And yet, sinners loved to be around Jesus. What is that? He actually gets this nickname, the friend of sinners, that's given to him by the Pharisees. It's not meant to be a compliment. It's meant to be an insult. All of these people that the religious elite, the church folk, wouldn't go near were close to Jesus. And so Jesus had this incredible ability to show radical conviction and at the same time radical compassion. I love how one author put it. He said, Jesus' message was not primarily injustice. It wasn't primarily immorality. It was primarily invitation. That's radical compassion. Come to me. Come and eat with me. I want to come to your house. Come to me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. And if you follow me, my burden is light. My yoke is easy. And I'll give you rest. So walking in wisdom towards outsiders means walking in the footsteps of Jesus. Radical conviction, radical compassion. Second, Christ-centered witness is revealed by urgency. Look back at verse 5. Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Now that phrase in the Greek, making the best use of the time, literally means buying back the time. purchasing the time, redeeming the time. It's the same word that's used to Christ on the cross when he purchased sinners to God. Buy back the time. There's this massive sense of urgency here. It literally means take advantage of every single opportunity that's in front of you. That's what that means. This is a massive challenge to you. This is a massive challenge to me as American Christians, because honestly, guys, we don't do this. Now, when I say we, I'm speaking generally, because I know that our church is rare. A lot of you actually do this, okay? But in general, as Americans, especially in the South, we struggle with this. I've shared this data before, so I'm not going to share all of it again, but the data shows that 95% of American Christians will never lead someone to Christ. 95%. And 80% of us American Christians who know all the doctrine, who could give you all the theology of Colossians, don't make a habit of even trying. It's a disconnect. Cognitive dissonance. I believe that Christ is above all, but as long as I'm getting out okay, who cares? Guys, you know what that means? You know what those stats mean? If you were to share the gospel just once a year, or let's just say you were to share the gospel once in your lifetime, you would be doing better than just about 80% of American Christians. Next to prayer, this right here is what I think is the most damning evidence that the church in America is not ruled by Christ. We are ruled by comfort. We are ruled by consumerism, and it is all about us. I want to be fed. I want some friends. I want community. I want to drive by Bible study. I'll come in on a Wednesday night, make my friends. We talk about the Bible and pat ourselves in the back, and I just go and live my life the way I want to live it with all those new friends that I just got, because that's why I'm really here. That's consumerism. You rule you, not Christ. This is a damning indictment on the Church of America. Guys, this was his mission from the very beginning. Back in the Garden of Eden, that we would be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth with more and more worship. This was his mission back with Abraham and back with Moses and the people of Israel, that they would be fruitful and multiply and draw all of the nations back into the presence of God, so there would be more and more worship. And this was the mission of God in Acts chapter 2, when Christ bought the church and established the church and gave his Spirit to empower the church, that the entire world, every tribe and every tongue and every nation would hear the good news that Jesus saves and that God loves them, and that the world will be filled with more and more worship. This is what he is all about. And so a church that has Christ on the throne won't be a church that just cares about the mission, but they will be a church that exists for that mission. Hard stop. He would exist for this mission, so much so that every single day our people will be looking for opportunities to carry it out. We will be buying back the time, making the best use of it, because there are still people on the outside that you know and that I know who need to be brought in. Guys, what if our goal wasn't just to share the gospel once in a lifetime? Could you just dream with me for a minute? Just dream. What if our goal wasn't just to share the gospel once a year, or even once a month, or even once a week? What if we woke up every day and we started our day with the Holy Spirit, and we cut the rope and we raised the sails of our ships, and we asked him for his power, and we asked him for his guidance, and we asked him for his fruit? What if when we did that, what if we asked him to give us an opportunity to bring an outsider one step closer to the inside? What if we started our day with that quest? Can I tell you something? We don't have to pray for it, Because the opportunities were already there. So instead of praying for the opportunities, what if we prayed for the courage and the strength and the grace that we need to buy them back? The opportunities are there every single day. I'll tell you what would happen if we did that. We would live with the kind of purpose and intentionality that would give the most mundane and useless tasks meaning. Like something as simple as ordering a pizza at Harris Teeter, which is my mission field. Okay. I know I shared this before, but we got a lot of new people here, so I never know what you've heard and what you haven't heard, but like literally that's my Harris Teeter is my mission field. And so I always go to get a slice of pizza, and I know that if I ask them to heat it up, I got a minute with them. I got 60 seconds. And I got 60 seconds to get them from this place one step closer to Jesus. It's as silly as buying a piece of pizza, but the other person is there. And one time I got my little elevator pitch. It's so cheesy. It's so dad. It's like, yeah, I'm a dad. It's okay. I get to be cheesy. You guys are still trying to be cool. I gave up a long time ago. So I'm talking to my pizza guy, and I'm like, how are you doing? And he's like, good, how are you? And I'm like, okay, now it's time for cheesy dad. And I was like, better than I deserve. Because that's like, I'm hoping that maybe he'll be like, what does that mean? And then I'm in, right? Okay. And so he did. He looked at me like, that's weird, what do you mean? And I was like, man, I used to be a thief. And then Jesus saved me, and now I'm not a thief anymore, and I'm a pastor, and I just wanted to tell you that. And he looks at me weird, and the lady who's doing the dough, middle-aged lady, she's making the dough, she looks up and she's like, oh man, I needed to hear that. I'm like, you did? Yeah, oh man, I'm really struggling. She comes back around, and we end up talking for 10 minutes. And my pizza got cold. I'm like, can you heat this up again? Something as useless as playing video games could actually become as meaningful as the greatest campaign in human history. I read a story this past week about a guy named Roman who lives in Houston. He runs soccer academies for refugees and immigrants. Now, before the pandemic, he would use soccer as an inroad to have spiritual conversations with these refugees and these immigrants, but then when COVID hit, he had to shut everything down. And he lost all the opportunity he had with all of these people. And so he and the other coaches are like, well, let's start playing FIFA on Twitch. And we'll just start streaming us playing video games. And people will watch us play video games. And they'll chat and they'll talk in this little chat box on Twitch. And maybe we can start conversations that way. Do you know what happened? These teenagers who would not have a conversation with him in person, all of a sudden start watching them play FIFA on Twitch, and they're engaged for 3-4 hours, and they are having all kinds of spiritual conversations. And what ended up happening was that the ministry grew so much, they decided to make it global. They decided to open it up to the public. And so people from all over the world are watching these guys, and they're playing along with them, playing FIFA on Twitch, and they're having spiritual conversations, and people are getting saved all over the world through video games. Okay? One guy was from the Netherlands. He meets Jesus by watching a guy from Houston play a video game. And then he leads 5 of his friends to Christ. Are you kidding? Any gamers out there? Man, I used to hate on you guys. I don't get it. Get on Twitch. Do it. Start it. Man, on a much smaller level, I love to play chess online. I know you can laugh. It's fine. I don't care. A few years ago, I was playing this guy named Aladdin, and he's from Syria. And you just play people from all over the world. And so I was playing a longer game with him, and I knew he was in Syria, and I knew it was really, really rough time in that country. It still is, but it was blowing up at that point. And I was like, hey man, how are you doing? In the chat. And usually people are cussing each other out in chess chat. Chess people are awful. Okay? And I was like, how are you doing, man? And he's like, I'm struggling. I'm in the military, and my family and I are in danger, and we're struggling. And I just typed back, listen, I'm a Christian. I can't help you in any other way but pray for you, and I want you to know I'm praying for you. Then we started talking when we were playing chess. We ended up carrying it onto Facebook. We found each other on Facebook, and we started talking through Messenger. And we had so many spiritual conversations, and then we lost touch, and I don't know what happened to Aladdin. I never got to see him convert. But with something as stupid as online chess, I was able to take a guy from being outside maybe just a step or two closer. That's all Paul's talking about. You might not start a global movement. You might not lead someone to Christ in the Netherlands, but you can make someone take a step every single day. Buy back the time. Some of you are really into TV and movies, and by itself, those things are a waste of time. But what if you redeemed them? And some of you are really into fantasy football, and I'm not going to lie, I used to be too. And then the Holy Spirit was working in my heart, and He started making me more like Jesus, and I stopped. You know who you are. I love you, all of you. But I got good news for you now. I'm not bashing fantasy football anymore. What if you redeemed it? Oh, all those hours in La La Land. It's like throwing a football is one thing of one level of useless. Like talking about creating a team, an imaginary team of people who throw a football is like another level of useless. But what if you redeemed it? What if you bought it back? Oh man. Some of y'all are in sports leagues, investment groups, running clubs. Some of y'all go to the same restaurant every week, you go to the same cafe, you go to the same brewery, you're not necessarily on a first name basis, but you recognize people. What if you took advantage of those opportunities? Just ask your waitress or your waiter if you could pray for them. I try to do it everywhere I go. It doesn't ever get any less awkward, but sometimes people need prayer. And you will never know unless you ask everyone. Caleb and I were at Ed's Tavern a couple of weeks ago, and we just, tag team a little bit, and we talked to our waitress. You know what? She needed prayer. She was struggling. She sat down at our table. She talked with us for a while. We started going back every week. We can't go back anymore. It's too expensive. But we went back every week for 4 weeks, and every time we'd come in, she'd hug us. See, my pastors are here. We connected her with Katie, trying to get her in the life group. You never know what God's doing. You never know. Take advantage of every opportunity. Buy back the time. God has given you the time. God has given you the interests. He's given you the opportunities. If Christ is preeminent in your life and His mission has become your mission, then take advantage of it. Guys, let me ask you a question again. Let's dream again. What if we, as a church, committed to doing that every day this week? It's just a challenge. It's just a what if. I don't know how many people. We got a lot of people in here. I'm not good at counting. There's at least 150 people in here right now. What if 150 people went out and every single morning prayed for the Spirit's power, for the courage, for the grace to look for outsiders that day and help them get a little bit closer to Jesus? And let me ask you a question. What if we did it the next week too? And the week after that? And the week after that? And we started doing that for years. 5, 10, 20, 30 years. Could you imagine? Because I just ask myself sometimes, what harvest is out there ready for us that we could enjoy together and celebrate together for the glory of God, if we would just redeem the time? I'll tell you what would happen. And I know it would happen because it's happening all over the world, because Christians do this all over the world. We're the oddballs, by the way, in America. It would look like China, where tens and hundreds of millions of people have come to Christ in the last 50 years. In a communist country under intense persecution, where they are razing churches and throwing pastors into prison left and right. Hundreds of millions of Christians today. It would look like India and Nepal and Iran and Iraq and Bangladesh. It would look like a gospel movement in our city. That's what it would look like. The question isn't, does the church have a mission? The question is, does the mission have a church? And will we be that church? Or will we just be consumers? Build a platform and get cool, we'll make some friends. Die. That was so morbid, I'm sorry. If Christ is above all, if he's really the center of our lives, then our witness will be urgent. And now we're going to fly, okay? Let's go. Third and finally, Christ-centered witness is recognized by grace. Look back at verse 6. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. This is so important. Let your words always be gracious and seasoned with salt. And I know every single one of you, like me, are like, oh no, I'm not good at that. Right? You know what salt does as a seasoning? I'm not a chef, okay? Don't take this as like Chef Ben's expertise. But I know some things about pepper and salt. At least I've heard some things. Maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong. I've heard that pepper adds to the flavor of whatever your food is, and I've heard that salt enhances the flavor that's already there. All right, let's just go with that, because I got a whole illustration based on that. So let's hope it's true. But salt brings out the flavor that is otherwise hidden to our taste buds. That's what salt does. That's what our speech is supposed to do with God. Our words, whether spoken or typed or written, are supposed to show outsiders how good God actually is. How compassionate he is. How kind and patient and forgiving and loving he is. Those things that are hidden from outsiders. They can't see it. Our words are supposed to be the salt that brings those things out and puts them right in front of their faces so they can't avoid it. So they taste and see that he is good. That's what our words are for. Listen, I know that you don't think God is compassionate. I know you don't think he's kind, but he really is. And I want to show you that by speaking compassion when people sin. I want to show you that by speaking kindness when people fail. I know you don't think God's patient. I know you don't think God's forgiving. But he actually is. And I want to show you that by speaking words of patience when people frustrate me. And I want to show you that by speaking words of forgiveness when people wrong me. Listen, I know you don't think God is loving, but he is. And I want to show you that by speaking and typing and writing words that are drenched in love, even when it's directed towards my enemies. Guys, what do you think God cares about more? Fake news or Christians who don't speak kindly? Let me put it this way. What do you think God cares about more? Unbelievers who lie or Christians who don't talk like Christ? Unbelievers who act like unbelievers or believers who don't? People who don't claim to walk with God, care about God, live like they don't care about him. People who do claim to belong to him, walk and talk like they don't. Guys, my news feed is full of people who don't know what it means to let their speech be drenched with grace. And many of those people are Christians. Some of you are in this room. And I'm saying that because I love you. And we're a part of the same body. It's a tragedy. It's an indictment on us as a church. That we have become experts in sarcasm and infants in sympathy. That we have become specialists in cynicism and novices in compassion. That we would rather than looking for the good in others, we would rather jump on the bad. Like a lion pouncing on its prey, ripping it to shreds, we pounce on the mistakes, we pounce on the sin, we pounce on the irony and the inconsistency, and rather than build up, we tear down and destroy with our words. There's a Christian satire site called the Babylon Bee. I used to really love it. But I'll be honest with you guys, as it's grown and as it's shifted hands, as it's, shifted content and leadership, I have become sickened by it. Absolutely disgusted. There's a lot of funny stuff on there. I used to find myself laughing at it more and more often than not when it would show up on my feed. But do you know that despite how funny and how smart and witty and probing that site can be at times, it actually fosters and reinforces the ethos of our culture rather than the ethos of Christ? That site is syncretism at its core. It is taking the ethos of culture, which is cynicism. It is taking the ethos of our culture, which is irony. It is taking the ethos of our culture, which is ridicule and canceling and all of this stuff, and it's just adding a Christian spin to it. In other words, the Christians running this site who are supposed to be showing outsiders the goodness and grace and kindness and compassion and love of Christ are doing nothing more than showing outsiders that Christians can be just as sarcastic, just as ironic, just as cynical, and just as contemptuous as they can. Let me ask you a question. If outsiders knew you were a Christian, and they heard the words you spoke, and they saw the words that you typed, and they read the memes and the articles that you shared, would they see a picture of God, or would they see a reflection of themselves? Let your speech always be gracious. And now you say, Ben, you're not being gracious. This is what Paul was talking about in his letter to the Corinthians, chapter 5. He literally says, listen, I'm not going to call out unbelievers. I'm not going to call out outsiders for their sin. That's what they do. I'm going to show them grace. I'm going to show them radical compassion. I'm going to show them radical conviction. But then he says to that church of Corinth, which was totally sensualized, it was totally syncretized, he said, but I'm calling you out because you're missing the point as a church. You're ruining your witness, and you're making God look not as good as he actually is. I need you to believe me when I tell you this, because these are hard things to say, and they are hard things to hear. My goal in this is not to make you feel bad about yourself. My goal in this is to show you that there is something bigger than you going on in this world. That there is a kingdom that is now at hand. It is already here. And the king who rules that kingdom is a king of radical grace and radical compassion and radical mercy and radical love. And the outsiders need to see that. Amen? Amen. This is who Christ is. Always gracious towards sinners. Always merciful and compassionate toward the spiritually bankrupt. Always kind, always humble, always forgiving, He always welcomes and embraces and even loves the worst of the worst. And you and I are here because that is true. But you and I are no different from anyone else. If we really believe that, we'll talk like it. If Christ is preeminent in our lives, if he has really captured our imaginations, if he is the beauty that has won our hearts, if he's really sitting on the throne of our lives and ruling and reigning over us, our words will be drenched in grace. Christ-centered witness is rooted in wisdom. It's revealed by urgency. It's recognized by grace. My prayer is that this witness would define us. Amen.